Greetings from one of my favorite hideaways, the trophy room at Hilltop Farm, here in Grafton, Wisconsin. I'm one of the grandchildren of Patrick Cudahy, the famous meatpacker. Patrick migrated to this country in 1849 with his mother, his father, 2 brothers, a sister, his in-laws, the Shaws, a family of 8. Rather typical, don't you know, of the Irish. Grandfather Patrick was the youngest, an infant of 3 months old when they departed Ireland, and when they got to the States, guess what? He was 6 months old. So now you have an idea of how long it took to get across the Atlantic Ocean in those days, in what they called coffin ships. And they came over here during the worst potato famine Ireland had ever seen. But first I'd like to show you a little short video that dramatizes the family crossing the Atlantic Ocean back in 1849, and you'll see the reason that they left the old country. The conditions in Ireland were terrible, just terrible. They were all starving to death with this potato famine. And to boot, the British were not making things any easier, I'll tell you that. I do this video, by the way, with my phony Irish brogue, somebody called it. So please bear with me.
It was the year 1849. The problems in Ireland were awful. Potato famine was so severe we were half starving to death. And the bloody English, they weren't making life any easier. So a lot of us said we're just going to have to leave the old country, much as it was breaking our hearts. But these coffin ships, they called them, which would take you to the States, had us all scared out of our minds. Some of the ships went aground, don't you know, right off the coast. And we heard when you got sick on board, they threw you over and into the sea. And when you got to Nova Scotia, well, you could run into an iceberg. Terrible, terrible, I tell you, just terrible. And when you got on board, things got worse, a lot worse. We was packed in like sardines, about 100 of us, and it took us 3 months before we saw land on the other side.
Well, now there they were, 8 weary travelers who had traveled all the way from Ireland in June of 1849, arriving in Boston on August 11th of that year, a trip that took almost 3 months. Their ship was called the Goodwin, by the way. There was Patrick's mother, father, 2 brothers, a sister, the Shaws, that's the in-laws. And of course, when they arrived in Boston, I'm sure they expected a warm, warm welcome from the USA. That was not the case. Not the case at all. There were signs all over Boston that said, "Help wanted, no Irish need apply." So they decided to move on to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now wait a minute. Why Milwaukee? Well, according to my grandfather's book about his life, immigrant agents were sent out to Boston from Milwaukee to convince people that Milwaukee was the land of milk and honey, that there were gold coins jingling on the streets. All you had to do is just pick them up. Well, Apparently the Cudahys were convinced. But now how to get there? How to get from Boston to Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1849, and with very little money. Now, according to another book, that of Patrick's brother, Ed, the group found a newly opened rail line, the B&A, that would take them from Boston to Albany, New York. And from there, they apparently boarded, get this, a cargo barge pulled by horses through the newly opened Erie Canal. So for something like a week or two, they were on this barge until they finally arrived in Buffalo, New York. Well, then on to Milwaukee. Fortunately, at that time, there were these newly launched steam paddle boats operating in the Great Lakes. And they could take you all the way from Buffalo to Milwaukee via how? Lake Erie to Detroit, then to the Upper Peninsula, and then down Lake Michigan to Milwaukee. I'm guessing, but I'll bet that all told, the trip from Boston to Milwaukee must have taken at least a month or more. And having been on the Atlantic Ocean for 3 months, they must have been a hardy bunch to have survived at all, especially infant Patrick. Of course, finally arriving in Milwaukee, I'm sure the Cudahys were too surprised not to find gold coins on the streets. And soon I'm sure they realized that everyone had to go to work, find a job to survive. Now that meant that the boys would have to find jobs if they were old enough, and in those days, it was something like 12. And even before that time, Patrick found all sorts of work to help the family, like helping in a brick factory, cleaning timbers, and delivering groceries. And yes, once in a while, going to school. Now the oldest boy, Michael, landed a job in 1850 with a big meatpacking company called John Plankinton, and eventually became Plankinton's general manager. And young Patrick became his assistant. Then when Michael went off to Chicago to join Armour, the Armour Packing Company, Patrick, really still a kid, took his brother's place at Plankinton. He was only 28. And then Plankinton died in 1881, and Patrick worked out some kind of a lease to run the Plankinton Company, and that led him to start his own outfit, the Cudahy Brothers Company. Well, then Patrick fell in love, and in his book he describes a colorful courtship with a lady named Annie Madden, and they were married in about 1870. Of course, they soon started to have children, one after the other, all girls, 6 of them, and they grew up to be the most beautiful young ladies Milwaukee had ever seen.
Catherine Cudahy Fernanding, Irene Cudahy Helmholtz, Helen Cudahy, Mary Cudahy Dahlman, Elsie Cudahy Beck, Josephine Cudahy Hoyt.
But then tragedy struck. In 1917, Helen, perhaps the prettiest of them all, apparently took her own life aboard a steamship on the way from New York to Paris. The New York Times reported that she jumped into the sea from her cabin porthole while traveling across the Atlantic Ocean. She was only 26, and I'll bet Father Patrick never accepted what had happened. Well, now, after Patrick and Anna had all those girls, they finally gave birth to 2 boys, Michael and my father, John. And in the years to come, these boys were to grow up and become men of great fame and stature. And now Patrick Cudahy, surely one of the great entrepreneurs of his time, died in 1919. He had created a huge industry, literally from scratch, and only with a meager education. And in the old tradition of what's called primogeniture, his oldest son, Michael, who just had returned from overseas duty at World War I, stepped forward to take the reins of the Patrick Cudahy Company. Then a multi-million-dollar meatpacking operation. Michael made good gains in the operation, and then in 1950, he was joined by Frank Cudahy, husband of Bibi Cudahy, my sister. Frank became an aggressive marketing manager and implemented the song, you remember it? Sweet Applewood. And it became a very nationally known jingle.
Sweet Applewood.
And then in 1960, Cudahy left the company. And to make matters worse, the Cudahy Company suffered financial difficulties. And then Michael became ill. It was thus that Michael's son, Richard, a Chicago lawyer and later a federal judge, assumed the top leadership role. Michael died in 1970. Later, in the 70s, financial results were much improved, and Richard sold the operation to the Bluebird Company of Philadelphia. It was known then as the Patrick Cudahy Company and was later acquired by Smithfield Foods, a large nationally known pork processing firm. But the Patrick Cudahy Company still operates under that name and is a growing division of Smithfield in Cudahy, Wisconsin, the city named after Patrick. And I should add that a magnificent statue of Patrick stands in Sheridan Park at the end of Layton Boulevard in Cudahy, Wisconsin.
Patrick Cudahy bake and smoke with Sweet Applewood. Sweet Applewood.